Thompson. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees at UVU and former president of Weber State University, so I've had looked at the dual mission from at least a couple of institutions. In terms of our panel, I was going to give a 40-minute introduction to each member, but felt like it would be better to hear from them. So you should have in front of you a little booklet that lists the people, and there is a bio. You can certainly read that to get some information. Very quickly then, let's start with Dr. Raymond Cross, President of the University of Wisconsin System, and then Dr. Steve Wrigley, Chancellor of the University of System of Georgia, President Joel Ward, Red Deer College in Alberta, Canada, and Sarah Lipka, Senior Editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education. So Ray, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Paul. See if I can operate this. There it is. Well, good morning. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for having me. My first time here in Orem, so it's a very pleasant site. I love the 3D nature of this environment. We're from the flatlands, so we don't get to see this 3D nature. I'm going to try to tell a little bit of a story about Wisconsin, so give me a moment for background, but I want to do this very quickly because I hope we can have some interaction on this issue. The UW system was founded in 1848 and is comprised of 26 campuses, and this is where it gets a little delicate. 13 of those campuses are two-year transfer institutions. They are not technical colleges. They only offer one degree, and that is an associate degree in the liberal arts for transfer purposes. That's why they exist. Many of them are relatively small, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. 13 other campuses are four-year institutions, two of which are Research One institutions, obviously the University of Wisconsin at Madison and the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. We serve about 170,000 students, 175,000 students. The technical college system, which is separate from this system, serves about 400,000 students. The state is a population about 5.7 million. I think you're around 3. Gives you a flavor for a little difference. But there are some changes taking place in Wisconsin that I want to talk about in a minute. These campuses were dispersed around the state in an effort to serve and provide access to every person in the state. Interestingly, the state of Minnesota had as part of its statutory policy years ago that everybody in the state would live within 35 miles of a college or university, which was quite a statement. So the commitment to access is rather lengthy. I want to spend just a moment on these two-year institutions. They're dispersed around the state, and if you, well, I'll get to that in a minute. I forgot to put this slide in front of it. Sometimes when you lose your hair, you can't remember a lot of things, so it's just... The challenges we face in Wisconsin are multiple. While your population is growing, so is ours, but our population is growing most rapidly in the 65-year-old age group and above. So in Wisconsin, the age group from 18 to 64 is only projected to grow in the next 20, 30 years by about 0.5%, roughly 15,000 people. So if you think about that, that challenge is really difficult. Well, you complicate that further when you realize that the metropolitan areas are growing, but the rural areas are shrinking even faster. And that makes it really difficult. And that's important because most of these two-year campuses are located in rural areas or small communities around the state. In many cases, these are the anchors that hold those communities together. So how do we retain that commitment in our workforce? Further complicating that is the economy of Wisconsin, as is true here and elsewhere, is increasingly dependent on an educated population. And this is part of that Georgetown study. I think someone quoted this yesterday or last night. We all are familiar with this. 95 to 97% of the jobs in the future require some college education. Embedded in this process, developed by another study, more of the students in the rural communities are leaving their communities and not living there, so you have this exodus from the rural community. Only 29% of the students in a rural community nationwide are going to college. 42% from urban areas, and the more concentrated the urban, it goes up to 48%. So our issues are complicated not just by the demographics, but by the changing desires of families. And I've had people say to me, gee, our whole community is, there used to be this here, there used to be that there, and there's nothing left but a convenience store and a gas station. It's pretty sad. So this is what we propose to do. We put it on the table last year in front of the board last October. And you can barely see this. I apologize for that. But there are 13 little tiny stars, and they are in reasonable proximity to these comprehensive four-year institutions. And so we are putting them under or a part of merging them with those four-year institutions, comprehensives, traditional, normal colleges. With one exception, that's Milwaukee. We're attaching 2 of these to Milwaukee. Well, Milwaukee is an R1. How is that going to work? Milwaukee is also an open access institution. So they're already familiar with that, and it is a challenge for them. Let me tell you, I've had a number of distinguished faculty, distinguished professors chew on me about this dual mission at Milwaukee. Hey, we can't both be a research institution and divert our money over here to an open access institution, to which I very academically respond, that's bunk. So, sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you with such an eloquent response, but I think it's important to understand that attitude persists in a lot of our institutions. And I think the senator very nicely last night articulated the problems California is having with their stratification of higher ed. I want to jump to another part of this. We had 3 principal goals in this merger. And everybody understands what's going on. So if you look at the northern part of that state, those 3 or 4 campuses, 5 campuses up in that region, in the last 6 years, their enrollment has dropped 52%. That's a massive drop in enrollment, and that's the result of the demographics and all these other factors hitting them. All of them, on average, are down about 32% in the last 6 years. So we felt like we had to do something in order to retain access. Access is really important in Wisconsin. It is true here. I'm not suggesting that we look at it any differently. It's really, really important. Obviously, you can't have access without affordability. The tuition at these 2-year campuses is about half to 2/3 of what it is at the 4-year institutions. Our commitment is to retain that pricing structure, so if students attend those 2-year campuses, they would still pay that lower rate. The third goal was opportunity. Those 2-year campuses only offer one 2-year degree, an associate degree in liberal arts, for transferability. We want to bring some 4-year degrees from those receiving campuses to those entities to expand opportunity. Now, I had one legislator say to me, rightly, gee, if demographics is the problem, why don't you just close some of these campuses? And I turned to him and said, well, if demographics is the problem, why don't we pay people to have more kids? That was facetious, but nevertheless. The point being, this is a challenge that our goal is to stabilize this enrollment by expanding opportunity and access to these communities. If we leave these communities, they'll fold up and be gone. And those communities are incredibly important to us. These are the challenges we face. Obviously, there are cultural differences between the two. The difference here, though, is these faculty were all credentialed in a very similar fashion to the comprehensives. So that's not too difficult. The board committed to transfer tenure. Tenure is transferred. You will not lose your tenure if your tenure track Faculty get to choose whether you will remain under the old procedure or under the new one. We have different student information systems, and that's the hub, the kernel of everything that needs to be done. So financial aid, all of those things have to pass through that student information system. And unfortunately, we have 13 different ones. Goodness, that's ridiculous, but that's what happened years ago. Obviously, the accreditation body is critically important in this, and if you don't believe that, just ask the people in Connecticut. We work closely with the Higher Learning Commission to get this done. Local politics, these small campuses, these buildings are owned by the city and the county. They're not owned by the university. All of them want to transfer them to the university so they don't have to keep them on their books and maintain them anymore. So they want to reduce taxes at our expense. So we're trying to convince them that's not possible. And then, of course, we all had shared governance issues. And part of the challenge here, I've been through this will be my fourth merger. Done it in the corporate world and in higher education. One of the critical things you want to do is reduce the anxiety of this process by speeding it up as quickly as you can. That's critically important, within reason. So we're on a very aggressive time frame. The second critical important thing is to do it for strategic reasons. So if you're in the private sector, you join with another company because they expand your market, or they give you ways to produce product at a cheaper price. So they improve you strategically for the future. Too often, as was the case in my opinion in Connecticut, they presented it as a money-saving act alone. That was their only purpose. We'll save money at this. It's obvious. You're going to have fewer administrators, fewer of those things. But that shouldn't be the lead, because that creates immediate problems. And of course, controlling the message. And I could talk about some of this stuff for a long period of time. I won't. I think my colleagues have some wonderful stories. I know Steve at Georgia, we're very envious of what they're doing to reduce the achievement gap in several of their institutions. And that's one of the challenges we have. The support systems for those students that start at the two-year campuses needs to be greater than the support system at the comprehensives, because they tend to, not typically always, but they tend to need more support, and that's part of our challenge. So that's the Wisconsin story.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm going low-tech, no slides or video or anything like that, so I'll have to engage you with my vivid words, so bear with me if you'll do that. I'm delighted to be here. I was very honored when Dave called and asked me to participate in this conference. I've been to Utah several times. It's a state we've vacationed in. Beautiful place. I always enjoy coming here, and anxious to learn more about the dual mission model here. Enjoyed last night very much. Learned a lot. I will note this: my son will be a senior at the University of Georgia this fall, and they just finished their semester. And he and a buddy decided it would be a good idea to drive from Athens, Georgia, to California and back in between semesters, and so he's just done that in 9 days. Which if you're 21 seems like a good idea, I guess. But he loved Moab, Utah. I've never been there, but he said that was my favorite stop, was Moab, Utah. So I don't have time to get there while I'm here, but I wish I could. Our story is similar to Wisconsin's. I'd like to provide a little context as well. We jumped into this consolidation effort in the fall of 2011, and at that time we had 35 institutions as part of the university system of Georgia under a single board of regents, a single governing board. We're now down to 26. We've not closed a campus. We've not closed any teaching site, but we have consolidated several of our institutions. We've done 9 rounds of it, and most of them are doing well, and we've got a few that we're having to continue to nurture. In our state, as I said, we've got a single board of regents, 19 members appointed by the governor, and our board is created in the state constitution, and the state constitution gives it all of the governing authority over our colleges and universities. So we own the property, we set the tuition, we hire the presidents, all of the authority rests with the Board of Regents. So it's a board with a lot of authority, and one of the things that's most important to us is hiring good presidents, because we do try to delegate on a day-to-day basis the running of the campuses to the presidents. We got into this consolidation effort for a lot of the reasons that Ray outlined in Wisconsin. If you draw a line across the middle of Georgia, the part of the state north of that line is thriving, particularly the metro Atlanta region. Population is growing dramatically. Our institutions are doing very well. South of there, with the exception of the Atlantic coast, Savannah and Brunswick and the Georgia Islands doing very well, but a lot in between is really struggling. Decline in population, especially a decline in the 15 to 24-year-old age group. We've got institutions that have suffered 25, 28% enrollment drops. One institution in southwest Georgia in the vicinity of 40% enrollment drop. So a similar kind of a story. I think it plays out in a lot of states. Rural America is where we're seeing the decline in population. In the southwestern part of our state, we had 9 institutions of one kind or another serving that part of the state. And the number of high school graduates who were ready to attend college has been declining rapidly the last 10 or 12 years. So our board, as we discussed what we needed to do to pursue our agenda, we outlined 5 or 6 years ago that we wanted to raise attainment levels in our state. That became our primary focus. We jumped into the completion agenda wholeheartedly. And so we then started asking ourselves, what do we need to do if we're going to move the needle on attainment? One of the things we looked at is, how are we structured? How are we organized? Our board was created in 1931. The basic outlines of our systems, those 35 those 35 institutions, was settled in the 1960s. We've basically looked the same since the 1960s. And I don't know about where you're from, but our state has changed a lot in 50 years. And somehow we missed some of that in the university system office. And we looked up one day and I think realized we may not be configured the way we need to be configured to serve our students. And that became the controlling question. How do we best serve students? Not how do we best protect our institutions, but how do we best serve students? And that you get a certain path when you chase that question as opposed to chasing other questions. So we started down the path of the consolidation effort, again, because we're a single board governing all of the institutions. We were able to drive that process from the system office with obvious local input. When we started, we had 4 research institutions, 4 R1s, 4 comprehensive, 15 state colleges, and then the balance in state universities. We were adhered to a pretty rigid sector system in our state and tried to make sure our institutions stayed in their lane. We wanted to avoid the Harvard envy that the president talked about last night. Because we're in a single system, we didn't face a lot of the problems around students transferring and that sort of thing, but still we were pretty committed to this sector difference. We didn't even have a policy on dual mission or dual function. So when we started down this path of consolidation, we quickly realized that was one of the first things we confronted, is what do we do about institutions that are very different in terms of mission and focus. We reached out to our accrediting agency. Very important thing to be very closely tied in with the accrediting agency. We talked with them. They preferred we approach it from the standpoint of, rather than calling it dual mission, we call it dual function. And they've been very supportive of what we've tried to do and have worked very closely with us, and we couldn't have gotten where we are without their support. So there's 4 or 5 lessons I'd like to share from our now 6 or 7 years of wandering through these efforts around consolidation. So I'll just walk through these quickly and be happy to take questions later. But one of the things at the outset that was real important is to state clarity of purpose. Why are we doing this? Because it was, when we announced we were going to do it, it unsettles your state. It unsettles faculty, students, staff. So clarity of purpose was one of the lessons that was very important to us. You've got to answer the why question. And on the campuses, the question really is, why are you doing this to us? That's how they interpret it, and you've got to understand that's how they interpret it. And so we started with policy, and we started by creating implementation committees on each campus representing every stakeholder. And we let them make a lot of the decisions. So clarity of purpose at the system level was important, but the second thing that was really important is allow for local flexibility. And that's why we created those implementation committees and essentially sent them on their way with reports back to us, outlining to them the tasks that they needed to tackle, but let them struggle where if we were putting together a state university and a state college, because our state colleges, we have a separate technical college system. Our state colleges provide gen ed and they provide applied associate's degrees. And that's a very different frame up than our state universities, which are the more traditional state universities that offer undergraduate and a few graduate degrees. P&T is different, admission standards are different, tuition is different, and we retained the authority to set the tuition. We let the campus come to us with a recommendation about tuition rates, and those played out differently in each consolidation. Much like Wisconsin, where there was a state college joining up with a state university, we allowed the state college rate to continue. Because continuing to allow students that access point was really important to us. And so while we let the campuses have a lot of flexibility, we retained ultimate authority to approve whatever decisions that they pursued. And it took most of them 6 or 8 months to get to the point where they were ready to go to the accrediting agency to ask for approval. And we stuck close to them. They had to grapple with, in some cases, the technical complexity around merging registration systems, different HR systems. Those are actually the easy things compared to talking about the name of the institution, what the mascot's going to be, and the school colors. And the first round, we announced 4 consolidations, and we provided a lot of democracy around some of those issues, and we concluded it's a really bad idea to let them struggle with what the name of the thing ought to be. And we made some mistakes, and so our board has sort of taken it over at the outset that we'll decide what the name of the new institution will be. Sometimes the name changes, and sometimes it doesn't. So that was the second lesson, allow a lot of flexibility. The third thing, leadership is important on the campus. The leadership has to be bought into what you're doing. They've got to be bought into the dual function, in our case, as we call it. If the leadership is not bought in, that will permeate the entire process and will inhibit the entire process. So leadership is very important. The fourth lesson, and this is one that's the most natural to have to deal with. It's very important to treat both missions equally and to treat both missions with the same level of support and attach the same level of importance to them. As Ray mentioned, some faculty openly come forward if you're in an R1 and express real concern about joining up with a state college. We had a state university, one of our very best in the system, in a long history, a proud history, and they didn't want to be a part of it. They didn't want a state college to be a part of them, and were quite vocal about saying we don't want them to be a part of us. Now, it turned out the state college didn't want to be a part of them either, but we've worked through that, and that institution is now thriving. But it's very important to treat both missions, both functions as equally valuable to the students. I think that the fifth thing, and this is probably the most obvious, but we're in the academic world, and we love data, and we love charts, and we love spreadsheets, but it's a very human process, and the biggest challenges are around culture that Ray mentioned, and addressing people's fears. So the most important thing early is to convince them this it will be good for you. It'll be good for your community. It'll be good for your students, and try to generate excitement around it. You're getting to do something that most people don't get to do, which is essentially to invent a new institution. And it takes a while to get people convinced that really is the case, and we may have a couple places we haven't convinced them yet, but it's very important to understand and deal with the human aspects of tackling these these kinds of efforts. Well, I feel like where our institutions have combined, where we've have dual function institutions, that they're doing very well, and then students are being served better. They've got access to more degrees, where we just had a state college and only had associate's degrees. One community had only 4 bachelor's degrees offered there before consolidation. Now there's 22. We can expand disciplines. So there's a lot of advantages in our case to going to the dual function model, and I was really interested to hear about the situation here and the history here. I think this really is the wave of the future to serve students in the way that we need to serve them. So I'll stop there and appreciate you listening and look forward to any questions. Thank you.
I will try to figure this out. Canada. We just got electricity. I think we're good. Okay, now it's working. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for your very warm and gracious welcome to the great state of Utah. I drive through here most years on the way to Palm Springs in the winter, starting off in Red Deer, Alberta, where it's usually middle of December, could be minus 30 degrees, into Montana, where we're buried in snow, into Utah, where we get a little bit of slush, and by the time we get to Palm Springs, it's 70 degrees. So I've never really been to Utah in this time of the year, so I want to thank you, Dr. Holland, for the opportunity that we can come and share our story. And it's a very personal story. And it resonates, I think it will resonate with you because it contains elements of many of the stories that you're hearing today. We live in what we call a rurban area. It's a combination of rural and urban. We're 100,000 people serving a region of 350,000 people. And there are small communities that we support within probably 100 kilometers or 60 miles of our institution. So we have been in existence since 1964 as a traditional community college, offering apprenticeship, trades, and technology programs, along with 1-year certificates and 2-year diplomas. As opposed to, we don't call them associate degrees in Canada, we call them diplomas. But we also had a transfer arrangement with our R1 universities in Edmonton and Calgary. And so we were able, for almost 30 years, offering in our community transfer degrees, first 2 years of degrees like education and nursing and business. But here's the problem. When they transferred, they never came back. About 90% of the students who left, and about 2,000 a year who left to transfer, they didn't come back. And so as we looked at it in our community, we had very low participation rates, half of what they were in urban communities in terms of students who transfer from high school to post-secondary. So it was a terrible injustice, we believed. And we saw it as an economic, social, and cultural impoverishment of our communities. And so in Canada, you'll probably notice that we're very much an egalitarian society with universal health care, access to education, low tuition, those kinds of things. And so when we see students without opportunities to complete their education in their home communities, we see that as a social justice issue. So we have tried for 30 years in our institution to become a degree-granting institution. So we decided on a new strategy. We had 2 strategies before in the previous 30 years that didn't work. We decided that it was really important for government who makes these decisions to understand that we have an issue, and it's a social justice issue. So we moved our ask to government to be able to grant our own degrees from a college ask to a community ask. And so governments, they love you to have white papers, and they like you to do all of the work and to justify a decision that is obviously and always political. So that strategy doesn't work because they don't necessarily read them, and they don't necessarily see the value for them in making a decision. So what we did was we rallied the community, the communities, students, school divisions, business and industry, and we looked for a hook. What was the story that everyone in our communities would say every single time a politician would come to town. And so the hook was really important. And every single person had experienced it or knew someone who had experienced it. Our kids are leaving and they don't come back. Everyone repeated it every single time to every politician. They weren't interested in reading the white paper either. They weren't interested in understanding the rationale, but they knew that their kids were leaving and not coming back. The second piece was that many kids, because they couldn't afford to transfer to an institution that would cost much more money and the added costs of a home or accommodation and food and those kinds of things, they weren't even able to participate in post-secondary education. So the problem was we had low participation rates, we had people leaving our community, and they were going to other communities and buying a house and starting a family and starting a business. And it was important that we be able to offer programs that included our own 4-year baccalaureate degrees. So the key elements of this, we called ourselves a comprehensive regional teaching university. And so as we were preparing to continue to push and push, one day I read in your esteemed journal Dr. Holland's story and Utah Valley. And so I thought I'd just pick up the phone, which I did, and I called Matthew and I said, tell me about your journey. Tell me about the dual mission, because we believe very much in that mission. We will be a comprehensive regional teaching institution which will offer both certificates, diplomas, trades, and apprenticeship, and the whole entire sector of degrees that we need in our community and in our region. We didn't use the term dual mission. In Canada, we had university colleges, which were sort of a dual mission, and we called them that. They failed miserably. We decided, though, that in our community it was necessary to be able to grant our own degrees. And by the way, having university partners as transfer sometimes works out, sometimes it doesn't. They control enrollment. We had our students, they counted them. We didn't even get to count them. They never went to that institution. And they got the money. So as you can imagine, not an equal relationship. And by the way, when they decided to make their decisions, they'd sometimes flip us an email and say, oh, by the way, you can only have X amount of seats in this program. Wasn't going to meet the needs of our region. So you can imagine how challenging it was and how unequal it was. So we were very committed to this model, and so we made our final ask to our government, and they promised an answer. And they promised an answer by Christmas of 2017. Have you ever met a politician who met a deadline? The answer is sometimes. I better say, to be politically correct. We had our answer on March 1st of this year, and at the end of my small presentation, I want to show you a 3-minute video of that announcement so you get a sense of the impact of that announcement on our community. So our institution, we face the same issues. We want to avoid the dual two solitudes. We created a structure, a school model, so that in each of our schools we had faculty who taught certificates, diplomas, and degrees. We didn't have a university piece and a college piece. We integrated it so that we wouldn't create the two solitudes, them and us. And so I hear a bit of that in some of the stories. And I said, you know what? It's not about faculty, it's about students. Right? This is a student-centered institution, not a faculty-centered institution. And that's a tough thing sometimes for faculty to hear. And the other piece of it was that we were going to be a regional teaching university, so the type of R1 research wasn't on our agenda, certainly in the short term. So when we talked about the type of business we were going to be and the type of institution we were going to run, it was about the same elements that you talk about. It's about access. We measure success by who we let in, not who we keep out. That's how you measure success. That's how you change lives. That's how people have opportunities to improve their lot in life and to make good choices and good decisions. And so if, in fact, your business model is too many applications raise the entrance requirements, too few lower them, that's not a very good business model. It's certainly not student-centered. So I call our model Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out until you meet the standards of the program that you're in. And so I often say to our community, if you're qualified, I say to students everywhere, if you're qualified, we'll take you. And if you're not qualified, we'll get you qualified. And we'll take you. And if you don't have the money, we'll find you the money. Because we're in the business of changing lives and providing opportunity. So access, affordability, inclusion, all of these things were critical to our model. And so we said to our faculty, and I took an abridged version of your letter, Dr. Holland, that you sent out to your folks, we are a teaching university, and that if you would like to dig for bones in Guatemala, all the power to you. There's lots of places where they would welcome and enjoy that. But our model is about connection to business, industry, social agencies, work-integrated learning, opportunities for students to practice what they've learned in a real environment. This is what we want to describe. This is what we told our community. This is what we told our government. This is what we told our students. And this is what we told our faculty. So this is the reality of the world we're working in and living in. And so if you have aspirations to do other things, we will help you make that transition. But we're about learners first, students first, always and only. And that's how we make our decisions in our institution. So work-integrated learning, every student, every program has an opportunity to understand what that looks like, what that feels like when they get into the community. Program advisory committees, connection with business and industry. Exactly the things you're doing here, Dr. Holland. Last piece of my story before I show you the video. We were struggling to get an answer. And so I called Dr. Holland and I said, why don't you come up and talk to our politicians? So he came up and didn't know me from a hole in the wall. But he took the time to come to Red Deer, Alberta, Canada, to tell the story of the dual mission model and how important it was for our government to understand how it could work here. And as the day after the announcement, Matthew called me and said, we're having this dual mission. Would you come up and speak? And I said, I'd be delighted. And by the way, guess what we just heard? Our announcement. The Minister of Advanced Education said to me, the decision they made and the impact that Dr. Holland had in the discussion that he had with our minister had dramatic impact on their final decision. We called it the decision. We invited the entire community. Although we didn't know what the decision was, when the premier comes, you kind of have an answer because they don't ever come to say no. So we put on a show, and here's the show. The decision announcement, March 1st, 2018.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Red Deer College. I am now very pleased to introduce the person who is here to let us know the decision, the Honorable Rachel Notley, Premier of Alberta.
I am so incredibly excited to be here today with you to announce that we aren't just creating one new university, we are creating two new universities, and that in fact Red Deer College has been given the green light to become a recognized university.
Clearly, you are very good at putting on an excellent party, and you're going to be developing a degree in announcing things. we know that this new degree granting institution will provide hope and opportunity for people across Central and Alberta. And so our government is so pleased to begin work immediately to start the college down the path to make this happen.
This is historic news. In fact, I would venture to say that this is as big a news for Red Deer in Central Alberta as 54 years ago when the college was announced and began as one of the network of junior colleges in Alberta.
The Government of Alberta and Red Deer College will begin working together with the Campus Alberta Quality Council to look for opportunities to offer additional high-quality degrees that meet the needs of the students, community, and local industry. And even once these degrees are developed, Red Deer College will still deliver the incredible trades, diplomas, certificates, and training programs that it's known for.
Building advanced education capacity at Red Deer College ensures students in Red Deer and region have more equitable access to advanced education services closer to home.
It is my pleasure now to welcome Joel Ward, RDC's President and CEO.
To our students, our communities, our families, our businesses, this day has finally come. And the significance of this announcement will resonate for generations to come, and it is because of all of you. We have been given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and together we will imagine and create the institution of which we can all be proud. Premier, Minister, Central Alberta's ready. Red Deer's ready. And RDC is most certainly ready for the future you have enabled today. Thank you. Merci, Miigwech. Little kids, a nice touch, eh? Whenever I give a bad speech, I bring the children from our daycare, and everybody in the audience they go, and then they never hear anything that I say. It works out beautifully. But you can see the impact that it has on a region and a community when you make decisions that benefit students and benefit the community. And so this was the most exciting news in our community in a generation. It has impact for our community for generations to come, and we will and continue to protect the dual mission model. And you heard the minister say, we will continue to offer all that we do plus degrees, because that's what's needed in our region, that's what's needed for our students, and that's what's needed for our communities, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell our very personal story about the transition that we are on now as our university journey and the difference it's going to make on the lives of the students and communities we serve. Thank you.
Sarah, please.
Thanks to UVU for this conference. I'm honored to be here. I will try to keep my comments brief because this panel is made up of people who are in the midst of this work. Your sleeves are rolled up, and I am just trying to keep up and take notes. I'd like to talk about three things. Mainly one, the different forms that the dual mission model takes. Also, two, some common questions that arise. And three, the demand for dual mission or variations thereof going forward. So, dual mission, it's not a common term outside Utah. We understand what it means here, and we heard the stories of Weber State and UVU and Dixie State last night. We're talking about community technical colleges and comprehensive universities under one roof. That kind of integrated model is relatively rare. It's out there, but it's uncommon. What's more common at the other end of the spectrum is separate institutions, maybe with separate boards, 2-year institutions and public 4-year institutions. One here, one there. But let's run through some of the variations in between. These are models that will be familiar to many of you, and it's not a perfect spectrum, but if you start at the separate institutions end, you get articulation agreements. There are plenty of those, some better than others, all intended to ease students' path to transfer. There are dual admission models. I get into Northern Virginia Community College, and I also get into George Mason University. I get into Niagara County Community College and Buffalo State University. There's also co-location. I can complete an associate degree at Pierce College and stay on that same campus to earn a bachelor's degree from Central Washington University. But now, closer to the other end of the spectrum, we have community colleges that confer bachelor's degrees, regional comprehensives that award certificates and associate degrees. The former is a hotter issue because it's more common, it's expanding, and it can be very contentious. We're up to about half of states where the legislatures have authorized at least some bachelor's programs at community colleges, often with conditions, limits on the number and type of programs, and requirements that they demonstrate the demand for these kinds of degrees in the workforce. The argument on the part of two-year colleges that are in some new states beyond those half that are already authorize it, trying to persuade the state legislatures to grant that authority. Their argument is to expand access and to meet workforce needs. Often that's met with a lot of opposition from four-year institutions that say that they're worried about duplication of programs and the stretching of scarce state resources. They also say they're worried about the quality of the programs and how the community colleges will maintain the quality of those programs. Now, of course, both types of institutions in these debates, the 2 years and the 4 years, are worried about enrollment and they're worried about tuition dollars. The model has really taken hold in Florida in particular, where lots of community colleges are offering lots of different bachelor's programs. And a study last month that was presented at the American Educational Research Association's conference, conducted by researchers at the University of Florida, found that four-year publics actually saw greater enrollment in bachelor's programs in fields where the local community colleges had added programs. And we're talking about business and teacher education and nursing. This discussion is live in several states: Illinois, Michigan, Maryland, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania, to have more four-year degrees available at two-year institutions. And sometimes the community colleges that get this authority become state colleges. They change their name to reflect that. And also right now, up next to our dual mission institutions at that end of the spectrum are the consolidated institutions, which I hope we'll hear more about on this panel: Georgia State and Georgia Perimeter, all of the community colleges in Wisconsin with several of the 4 years. And the argument for that is efficiency. So there are some questions that arise when different forms of the dual mission model takes hold. One is, what's best for students? Are there partnerships out there that are on the other end of that spectrum that are effective? What are those? What do they look like? If they're not effective, why not? That seamlessness that everyone talks about, how can that better be achieved? We hear that word seamless as people are trying to make these articulation agreements or other partnerships, but the transfer pipeline is still leaky. So if you bring institutions under the same roof and a community college is subsumed to some extent, what is lost? Well, it can be hard, I hear, to hold on to those original values. That community college mission can get muffled. And there are changes. Costs creep up. They might not get as high as at the 4 years, but that tuition goes up. And there are admission standards in some programs. It's not a fully open door anymore. There may be some programs that are still open access, but when it's not a fully open door, that message resonates with prospective students. That matters to them, and it may not bring as many in as otherwise would come to a place where they know they would be welcome. President Holland told us last night that the pull is toward the university side, and I found that comment striking, not just because of the pull, but because there are sides. I've heard that when resources are allocated, community college functions somehow find themselves standing behind the door. They're not seen as much in that resource allocation. And I wonder about the storytelling too. Who are the success stories? There's the culinary arts student who gets her MBA, and yes, she is a success story. But what about the student who gets her certificate in collision repair technology and opens his own little shop? Is his still a success story we tell? The last thing I want to talk about is demand for dual mission on three fronts. One is demographic. Utah is blessed in the witchy tallies that everyone watches. Nationally, that's really not the case. The Northeast and the Midwest especially are seeing sharp declines in the number of high school graduates. But guess what? Tens of millions of adults, many of them place-bound, could benefit from a post-secondary credential, and there's a lot of discussion about that from Georgetown and elsewhere. How can higher education be more accessible and be more flexible to them? Another front is economic. Employers are looking to hire workers with bachelor's degrees, and that's only going to continue. The American Association of Colleges of Nursing is talking about the BSN as the credential for entry-level nurses, and there's a similar trend in occupational therapy, and I think we'll see in other allied health fields. And then the third kind of demand is political. We've talked about Harvard envy, and yes, colleges want to move up. They want to move up in the US News rankings. They want to move up in the Carnegie classifications. Those are strong, strong impulses, because those are the things that get you recognition. But CTE is really hot right now, especially among policymakers focused on in-demand jobs. And so maybe access and success could become the new prestige. I'm curious to hear what my fellow panelists have to say, and I'm happy to be part of it.
Thank you very much. Ready for questions? I'm ready to start. If somebody else has a question on the tip of their tongue, but I'm ready to start if you would. Okay. I'm really interested in, there was an example of a student who came and got an MBA and so on. But I like your story about, do we tell success stories of someone who has a technical skill like auto mechanics? And do we tell those stories? Do you have those stories at your institutions?
The technical college system is separate in our state.
Right.
So it's not part of the university system. We have a separate technical college system which is governed by a separate board. And they tell those stories very well, actually. So.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think success. How do you measure success, right? So, I mean, institutions really love to take someone who's very successful and use that as the story. But what about the single parent who lives in a small community, doesn't have an opportunity to take post-secondary because perhaps he or she's raising a family, perhaps the distance is too far, perhaps they have a job, perhaps they don't have access to the program. So how you measure success is really interesting. And we like, the rankings and those lots of people are interested in rankings. I'm not interested in rankings. I'm interested in student success, whatever that looks like. And how you define success and how we've defined success, shame on us. Because we just parade out people that are very successful and say this is because of us, when in reality, every single student who makes it through a program is successful. Right? And so how do we celebrate their success? Look, I understand the reality of what you're talking about, Sarah, when you talk about the aspirations of institutions to be something that they're not. But if you focus on students, you focus on student success, and you focus on respecting the taxpayer who funds a lot of it, then you don't get driven by folks who might have a different perspective of what success looks like. It's not about success of faculties, and yet they're powerfully important to what we do. But we measure success by how students are successful, and they'll tell you. Let them tell you their stories. Let them tell you if they're successful, right? And success is someone who starts their own business. Success is the first generation parent who stands up and says, I got a diploma. I'm the first one in my family, the first one in my town to get a diploma. An Indigenous woman who graduated from our institution a couple of years ago in her 60s, the first in her family ever to graduate, setting an example for her family and for her people. I mean, that's the success story that we should be proud of. Right? Not the Harvard envy. Everybody wants to be Harvard, but guess what? There's only one Harvard. The rest of us need to do our jobs.
Right. Anne, please. Thank you. Senator Milner.
So I'd be interested in, because you're all dealing with kind of, we in higher education, we deal with the kind of histories and cultures of our states, our institutions, et cetera. And if you had the opportunity to rethink systems and create a higher education system today that you think would best serve our students and the needs of this country in terms of preparing an educated citizenry that has the talent and the skills needed for the workforce of the future, the professional needs of the future, et cetera. Where would you start, and what are the things that you would consider, and what might be the elements of that?
That's an easy question. We don't do
Do you have 3 hours? I think it's probably, as you and I were talking about earlier, and as you mentioned last night, California's master plan is woefully deficient. I do believe that the concept that Joe is talking about is really, really important. How do you have, we use the word access, but then we put up barriers that are invisible to us, but visible to students who come to us, and they don't really believe they have access, be they financial or other criteria. So we have to create an attitude of you can do this and reach out to that. And that's that portion of our population in all of our states. In 2 zip codes within the Milwaukee City region, over 50% of the African American males are unemployed. It's unbelievable. And in our society, we have not elevated all people in this process through education and reaching out to them. They just don't believe it's accessible to them. Second part of that is, and I'm getting to an answer in a minute, Ann, or trying to. The second part of that is we have forged in our DNA the concept that credits and time and seat are important. And we measure that, going back to the Carnegie model, for years and years and years. When in fact, technical education in particular has for years focused on competency-based processes. And at some point, we're going to do away with our currency of credits and focus on competencies and ways to measure that. Now, why is that important? Sarah mentioned the number of folks in our population that are adults, have some college. In Wisconsin, that's roughly 750,000, somewhere between 750,000 and 900,000 adults that have some college but do not have a degree. So we've created what we call UW Flex. It's a competency-based program. You're familiar with something similar here, Western Governors University, et cetera. When we went to the Department of Education, they didn't know how to deal with this. They just didn't know how to deal with it because everything is, financial aid is all based on time and seats. And in reality, we do want to expose students to some of the social aspects and the important part of working as a member of a team and not just in isolation. I got that. But when you're 45 years old and have 3 kids and you've got a job and you don't know how to elevate yourself in that stature, education is the key to that. So if I were to design a system, I would probably put the technical college system, in our case, as is the case of Georgia, under some sort of a system. I fear that in some ways because this is not Russia and we aren't calling each other comrades and we aren't, I fear some massive central planning process that eliminates some of the flexibility that we need in our society. At the same time, there is not a synchronized process that makes sense to serve the people in our states. And that's part of the challenge. And you can't change that in a moment because of our history. But we are working on that slowly, and that will take time. And the barriers to that are just like trying to merge 2 high schools, let alone the name on the name and the logos that Steve's talking about. Try to merge 2 high schools in a region when their enrollment is really bad. My kids played football against those kids. I'll never, that goes. We have some of those similar problems politically in a state that is declining in that age group. So that's a long answer, went around the horn a bit. So.
Good morning, Carrie Hauser, President of Colorado Mountain College. Thank you for your commentary this morning. And I used my sticky notes, I want you to know. So I have a couple just mostly comments. I just would love to sort of hear you flesh out a little bit more. Sarah, you mentioned most of these, and just to hear you maybe dig into some of these a little bit more. Sort of the 2-sided coin of mission creep, and then the other side is consolidation. Sort of the politics around that. Certainly you've seen that in Wisconsin, especially when there's a governor involved and otherwise. Do we all become sort of everything to all people? Is that sort of the shift? How do you market yourself if there's not sort of that kind of niche that some of us have served in the past? So there's certainly some challenges there. And then I'd love to hear a little bit more about this sort of channeling Alexander Aston or some of the great researchers out there around, is it reputation and resources or is it access and success? Why is college, quote, lesser than and university more than? So however you want to tackle those. Thank you.
So I'm not sure which part of it to jump into first, but if we think about the dual mission and mission creep, I mean, as I'm hearing about the different kinds of institutions in Utah, I wonder, well, what about SNO and SLCC? Will they start offering bachelor's degrees? And I think there's just such, it's part of the American psyche, but this idea of moving up and of being offering the next thing, there's a lot of good reason to do that. And we've talked about the adult student population, place-bound students, and wanting to increase access and wanting to increase options, but you wonder if at the same time something is lost. Is it lost because the community college, the traditional community college, means something to communities, and people know that it's an open access institution, that it will serve you in all kinds of different ways. And I think that the way we talk about access in higher education and the way access is perceived by prospective students can be very different. And President Cross was just talking about that. And so that's how messages resonate in local communities is something that I think colleges need to pay a lot of attention to.
Other responses to her question?
I think you mentioned about every institution become all things to all people. I think we have to resist that. I think, in fact, again, in our state, we're a single board, 26 institutions, 4 different sectors, and we're still adhering to the sector differences, and I think that's important. I do think not every institution has to look the same. I think that's important, that not every institution in our state has to look the same. Georgia Tech is one of the world's great research universities, and we want it to keep being one of the world's great research universities. We don't need 26 world's great research universities in our system, and I think it's important that in our state, under our board, that we're self-conscious about those differences, about maintaining them. And for institutions that are primarily, like our state colleges and to some extent our state universities, serving a community or a region, that is their focus, and that is what we expect of the local leadership, and that their curriculum reflect regional needs, regional workforce needs, those kinds of things. I don't think we should move toward all things to all people. I think one of the things that, going back to Senator Milner's question, I do think we've got to be a lot more adaptable and flexible than we typically have been in public higher education.
You know, up in North Dakota, we're looking at this, and one of our presidents is in the front table there, Tom Mitzel. We're an agricultural state. We don't want our rural areas depopulated. We want to, be balanced out. We have a huge boom in the energy area, probably 80,000 new workers coming in. So we're kind of a hybrid of these situations. Some cases rural depopulating, some cases increasing number of workers. But one of the arguments that I'm prepared to make to our legislators, and I'd be interested in comments here, is that the competition isn't really between our other universities. We have 2 research universities, 4 regional, and 5 community colleges. It is the Arizona states. It's this massive online disruptor coming, and that we need to maintain the quality, the human contact, the community integrity in ways that online from a great distance won't do. So I haven't heard anybody mention that the other competitor are completely virtual universities that don't have a connection with your community, your values, your culture. So any comments on that, the rise of totally online competitors coming into your states?
No, I'm not willing to go at it. But, to my colleague in North Dakota, I think there are a couple of issues we're trying to deal with, and I think all of us are using more hybrid kinds of activities in our classrooms. And we are also trying to compete in the online area. But it's really boiling down to 3 or 4 major institutions that are doing that. Arizona State and Phoenix is the world, and Penn State, and a few of those have over 100,000 students in those campuses. Western Governors is 100,000 or so. So we're looking at specifically partnering with the businesses in Wisconsin for online activity, focusing on what we would refer to as B2B. Do I think this is going to be competition to us? We did an analysis a few years ago, and it wasn't the online campuses that were hurting us. It was the local for-profit private colleges that were really hurting us because of so much debt those students were accruing and not necessarily completing. And they were pulling from our campuses because we weren't competing with them. The money they spend on marketing. Southern New Hampshire, I think he spends something like $8 million a month on marketing. We don't spend squat on marketing. Well, that's not fair to say. We spend a little bit, but and I think that's what gives them an advantage, and that's hard for us to deal with, is that massive amount of marketing money they spend. So I don't have an answer for you. I really don't. We've looked at it. We don't think it's as bad as we projected, although I think Sarah mentioned earlier that the declining number of high school graduates, we have gone from, in the last 7 years, from about 70, in 2010, there were 74,000 roughly high school graduates in Wisconsin. We're down to 64,000, and we're leveling off for 3-4 years, and then it's dropping into the 50s after that. So we're seeing an enormous decline in high school graduation numbers, and that's impacting us a lot more than the online stuff.
Yeah, so I'd ask a question differently. That's if they're successful, why are they successful? And so if they're meeting a need that we're not meeting, then we need to understand what that is. And so when these, whether they're for-profit or whether they're online institutions, they've obviously found a market that is saying we're not meeting the needs of this demographic. So it's the distance learner. It's I need flexibility in how I learn. I need flexibility in how I'm assessed. And so if there's a need, somebody's going to fill it. So I think we need to ask ourselves, why are they successful? Should we be worried about whether they're successful or not? And is there a way in which we can understand better in our own communities how we can meet the needs of those individuals who are accessing online institutions or distance learning institutions or for-profit institutions? Because clearly there's something that we're missing that they're filling, and they're going to fill that gap every single time.
Sarah, do you want to respond?
I'd like to add one thing. The comments that the two presidents made were really on point. And I think you're talking about Arizona State and Liberty and Southern New Hampshire and Western Governors, and these programs have great marketing efforts, and they're really attuned to the sort of convenience that older students especially are looking for. The study that I mentioned from the University of Florida researchers that came out last month about what had happened to enrollment at four-year institutions when community colleges in their regions had started bachelor's programs in nursing and teaching and business, and found that more students were coming in, and of the students coming in, more were finishing those bachelor's degrees at the community colleges, and more were enrolling, transferring, and finishing those bachelor's degree programs at the 4 years. The sector that saw a decline when those bachelor's programs were introduced was the for-profit sector.
Steve?
I just wanted to add, I think Joel made a great point. If the market is there, then there's something maybe we're not doing. And all of our institutions offer online, some more than others. We've had an explosion in online course offerings from like 1,500 6 or 7 years ago. We're now around 7,000. I'm sure that story is very familiar. We've made an effort the past several years. Our entire gen ed number of courses through eCore, a system-wide effort, is all online, and the textbooks are free. And the enrollment in that program is growing pretty significantly. It's available to any student enrolled in any one of our institutions. You can actually take a gen ed class. If you're enrolled in one institution, you could take an eCore class from another institution, and it's all in front of you as you register. And starting this fall, we designate which of the classes outside of eCore, an upper level course, where the textbooks are open education resources or free or reduced cost textbook. The student will be able to select from the same course where the textbook costs are free or reduced. So we're trying a lot of those kinds of things. because I think for some students it's important. I think there'll always be students who will need in order to be successful, an entirely online course is not going to work for them.
Other questions? If I may, we do have a couple of minutes. Clayton Christensen wrote a book, I can't remember the year, but I think it's 10 years ago. The Innovative University. He said in the book, and I know Clay pretty well, but he said, this is going to disrupt higher education and there will be hundreds of colleges that go out of business. That has not happened to my knowledge. There were 5 last year, private colleges that went out of business. But why haven't colleges gone out of business with what's going on, with all that disruption? Why haven't you gone out of business?
Yeah, the answer is, I think about this all the time, and back to the senator's question around what do we need to do? I think reading the Chronicle of Higher Education, which I read in Canada, because I like to understand what's happening in the States, our sector is due for a disruption. They said it was going to be radio. They said it was going to be television. They said it was going to be the computer. They said it was going to be the internet. But it hasn't changed. And the reason it hasn't changed is because society sees post-secondary education as a rite of passage from adolescence to adulthood. And that experience is so powerful, and the taxpayer is so willing to pay for it no matter what the cost, that we will never have the disruption that we need. We will never have the change we need in post-secondary, because there's no reason to change, no compelling story to make it change. But I do believe that there have been a number of institutions who have closed their doors over the last number of years, and that was never heard of. So we're ripe for disruption. I don't know what it is, but one last comment. In Columbia, one of the universities there, the students elect their president, Dr. Holland. The students elect the president. What would that look like in your institution?
Well,
I'll add briefly, Clay Christensen is a great thinker. Some of disruption is hype, and some of disruption is real. So MOOCs are not the great answer. MOOCs in philosophy, we're going to teach introductory philosophy at San Jose State University. That didn't happen. But the competition from the big online programs is real. And guess what? More institutions have started online programs in hybrid models. There haven't been as many closures as some people have predicted, but there have been some, and there have been consolidations. And so some of that disruption is real, but some of it doesn't quite pan out the way people think it might.
Right. You had a comment, Ray?
Yeah, thanks for the philosophy introduction. Plato argues that learning actually takes place in the dialogue, his terms, between the teacher and the pupil. When we're effectively capable of leveraging that dialogue through technology in an effective way, I believe that's when the disruption occurs, because that's fundamental to learning, is part of that dialogue. How you achieve that and how you leverage that is really important. I would also add to the Colorado College comment, I think there's already mission creep. It's all over the place. It's in Wisconsin, we're trying to put walls up, and the idea, I think Joel's point about, we can't worry about that. Let's just focus on what's the best way to help students.
Thank you very much. Let's give them all a hand. This has been a wonderful panel. Thank you.